Welcome to the Manga Bay Newscast. It's March 24th, 2021, and I'm your host, Mike Gorecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Today we're discussing a new investigative report by Manga Bay's contributing editor for Brazil, Carla Mendes. In an article titled Deja Vu as Palm Oil Industry Brings Deforestation, Pollution to Amazon, Mendes details the results of a year-long investigation into allegations that the environmental and socioeconomic impacts of the palm oil industry's operations in Southeast Asia are now being felt by indigenous communities in the Amazon rainforest. We speak with Mendes on the program today. She tells us about visiting the Ture Mariquita Indigenous Reserve in Brazil's Pará state, where she experienced the effects of pesticide use in a nearby oil palm plantation firsthand. Members of an indigenous community within the reserve say that they've been experiencing health problems like headaches, skin rashes, and stomach ailments since the plantation was put in with no buffer zone between it and their community. We also speak today with Sandra Damiani, a researcher at the University of Brasilia who led a study to determine whether or not these increasing health issues were the result of oil palm plantations' activities. Damiani's study found herbicide and pesticide residues in both the surface water and groundwater of the Ture Mariquita Indigenous Reserve. While the levels of these residues found by Damiani's study fall within legal limits in Brazil, elsewhere, such as in the European Union, those levels far surpass what's allowable. Our third and final guest on today's show is Felicio Pontes Jr., a federal prosecutor in the Amazon region who's trying to hold the palm oil companies responsible for polluting indigenous communities. Pontes Jr. helped file a lawsuit on behalf of the affected communities all the way back in 2014, and has been fighting in court ever since to have a forensic investigation done looking into pesticide contamination and other social, environmental, and health impacts in the Ture Mariquita Indigenous Reserve.
What we did, it was try to answer the question, what is the things that was causing those problems to indigenous people? And we tried to do that into an official investigation.
Palm oil has become one of the most commonly used vegetable oils in the world. It's found in everything from peanut butter and ice cream to toothpaste, shampoo, and lipstick. It's also used to make biodiesel for cars and trucks. Two Southeast Asian countries, Malaysia and Indonesia, produce about 85% of the world's palm oil, and the damage done to those countries' rainforests, wildlife, indigenous peoples, and water supplies have been well documented, as have the issues arising from the palm oil industry's growth in Africa in recent years. But it's much less well known that palm oil production is growing in the Brazilian Amazon as well, and bringing with it many of the same issues. Carla Mendes reported for Manga Bay that even though Brazil accounts for just 1% of global palm oil production, the industry is growing quickly in the Amazon, especially in northern Pará state, where about 90% of Brazilian palm oil production is located. Here's Mendes on how she first started investigating the impacts of that escalating palm oil production in the Amazon.
This story really intrigued me from the beginning because usually when we think about palm oil, you just think about in Southeast Asia, right? And when we think about the damages in the Amazon rainforest, usually we think about cattle, mining, and other development projects, but we don't hear much about palm oil, so that's what really intrigued me. And it's such a very underreported issue in Brazil. Because, of course, if we look at the scale of this industry, it's much smaller than cattle, mining, soy, this kind of thing. But the thing is that it has advanced a lot in the last decade in the Amazon, especially in Pará state, where I carried out my investigation. That's the state that accounts for more than 90% of the palm oil production in Brazil. And it's causing a lot of damages to the communities there, especially for indigenous people, Quilombola, which are descendants of former runaway slaves, and small farmers. So then I started investigating, and we see that the list of wrongdoing is almost countless.
Can you give us a sense of what these countless instances of wrongdoing include?
I started doing this investigation with land grabbing issues, which is still a piece we'll have as a second part of this investigation. because we talked a bit about it, but there is a huge issue in Pará.
Land grabbing refers to land acquisition deals that happen without the free, prior, and informed consent of local communities, which often result in people being dispossessed of their land. These deals can be land purchases or rental agreements between governments and private or public sector entities, and they often occur in a sort of legal gray area between traditional land rights and modern property law.
And then as I conduct this research, I started finding a lot of things, especially related to water contamination. And we used academic research that found traces of pesticides inside and around indigenous reserves in Pará. And then another one that also found traces of pesticides in the rivers in another production area in Pará. So we could see that something that has this way of operation and is repeating it in several parts. So we have this water pollution. We also have problems related to the damages to the traditional way of life of indigenous people, as all of them claim that, fish and game is scarce because of palm oil. And this is somehow related not only to pesticides, because it pollutes everything, poisons everything, but also because they didn't set up a buffer zone.
Mendes writes in her piece that Brazilian law requires a buffer zone of 10 kilometers or 6 miles between development projects and conservation areas, but a loophole in the law allows for no buffer zones to be created around indigenous reserves.
And also satellite imageries from academic research showed that areas of native forest were cleared to palm oil, which is, kind of unmasked the companies and the government's claims that they only plant palm oil in previously deforested land. So there are all this wrongdoing going on and affecting the livelihood of these people.
And you visited one of the affected communities during your investigation, right?
We went to the Turé Mariquita Indigenous Reserve in November 2019 to see with our own eyes what was happening there. Because my first trip to Pará for this story was in August 2019 for the land grabbing stuff. And then arriving there, I found out this and I said, no, we need to go there and to show the facts on the traditional communities. And then we were on the ground for, I think, 5 days or so. And on the roads there with an indigenous guide, because to go to the Amazon, to this part, we need to have a local with you, because there is no internet connection and GPS, this kind of thing. So we negotiated, they allowed us to be there. And then I told them what to be doing. And then we had them as our guide to go to the spots where this wrongdoing were doing. And another interesting thing that we witnessed is that they've been claiming, they've been doing a lot of protests against the companies for a while, for a decade, saying that they are suffering the damages. And as they are sick of not being heard, they've been seizing agriculture tractors and equipment from the company, as a way to try to be heard. And when we were there in one of the villages, they had 2 seized tractors. And in this one, they were knocking down palm trees that were just 80 meters from their houses. It's unbelievable. And in the other one, another village, it's in another indigenous reserve, the Tembé Reserve. We visited 2 indigenous reserves there. So we were there the day after they seized agricultural tractors from another palm oil company. So they were trying to take the lead, and because it's been a decade, and even federal prosecutors have been trying to get a response, and to prove this contamination there for 7 years, and without success so far. So it's not an easy thing, So that's why we decided to do this long report, kind of joining all these findings with the wish to help somehow, because the list of wrongdoing is huge, academic research, a lot of things. So they just need now to have to do measures to try somehow to be compensated for the damages, because the nature is destroyed. There is no way to come back, but at least some compensation for their lives, because the situation is getting worse and worse each day.
What was it like for you visiting those communities?
It's really shocking when we were there to see this palm oil so close to the villages, and also the lack of buffer zone even for palm oil mills. And we saw they dumped palm oil residue in the river, and also the stink of palm oil pesticides. I felt that myself, I felt dizzy, I started coughing, I had to go into the car because it's really, I could not withstand that. And I thought how people could work smelling that stink. So it was really, really shocking, in many, many ways. And there is one specific case that also shocked me a lot. That's the case of a school that's completely surrounded by palm oil. So it's all surrounded, and the companies keep claiming that they don't harm the environment, they don't bring health issues to people. When they sprayed pesticides around the school, it has to be closed for 3 days. And no one could pass through the area for 2 days, So that's the thing that we need to challenge and, investigate more and shed light on these things, because all the things are happening in the depth of the Amazon forest, rainforest, where we have lack of enforcement. We know that somehow the government, it's a huge area, but at the same time, there is no political will to oversight, to do monitor in this area.
Wow, so your investigation initially began to look into claims of land grabbing, and you plan to go into detail about that in a follow-up to the piece that's up now. But once you started looking into those claims, you just discovered all these other issues like pesticide contamination and deforestation?
Yeah, because, I started investigating it focused on the land grabbing issues. There are unbelievable things happening there. As I dig deeper, and then I found these traditional communities affected after talking to prosecutors. And then I said, I need to go there. I need to see this. The problems are much bigger than I imagined. And then as I started investigating, I really found that, it was really huge. And as you could see, the piece is 10,000 words just talking about pollution and all these effects on the livelihoods. There was no way to go in depth into the land grabbing issues. So there will be a second part of an investigation into that.
What did you find in regards to deforestation driven by palm oil production in the Amazon?
Yeah, that's the thing, because all the palm oil companies say that's a sustainable industry, we are green and this kind of thing. And the Brazilian government launched in 2004 a biodiesel program to, bolster the production of biofuel, and palm oil was one of the supplies they'd like to use. And then in 2010, the government launched a palm oil sustainable program. And at the time, they said that their purpose was to stimulate this industry, but they wouldn't allow the agricultural frontier to surpass towards native forest. And then in two academic research, Brazilian academic research, we found that, through satellite imagery, that they proved that they did cleared land for palm oil. In the Turé-Mariquita Reserve, where I visited, they found that the area surrounding the Indigenous demarcated reserve was cleared. So that's why the indigenous people claim these bad effects and scarcity of fish and game, because they used to hunt and to fish around their original area. And also in a Quilombola area, another researcher found that. And then when I started digging deeper, I found there are several studies showing that, between 8% and almost 40% of deforested land for palm oil in Brazil. So we see that there are many, many claims against the company's propaganda about it.
Yeah, and we're going to talk to a researcher, Sandra Damiani, who led one of the studies you've been referring to. But first, tell us about the palm oil industry in Brazil. What company is operating in the Ture Mariquita Indigenous Reserve, for instance, where you visited? And how many other companies are active in the Amazon right now? And how much land have they converted to oil palm plantations?
Yeah, and I think to be good to kind of provide a small panorama of the palm oil industry in Brazil. As I mentioned before, it's not something that it's really underreported, because if you look it globally, it's not that significant, as we see that Brazil accounts for just 1% of global palm oil production. They were 540,000 tons in 2020, sorry. But at the same time, it has increased a lot in the last years. And for example, between 2010 and 2019, the area increased almost fivefold to 236,000 hectares. So it's a big increase, and many researchers are worried about the expansion of this industry, because, as I mentioned before, Brazil has this biodiesel program, and where it sets a percentage of biodiesel to be used in diesel. And by 2030, so it aims to double the share of biodiesel in diesel. So there are the thing that worries the researchers. At the same time, Pará is the Brazilian state with the highest rate of deforestation, is the state with the highest rate of land conflict. So the palm oil kind of add more, conflicts in this area. And in Brazil, we have basically 8 major companies working in the palm oil industry. But for example, the top producer is called Biopalma, which is the one that is in direct conflict with the També indigenous people from the Ture Mariquita Indigenous Reserve we visited. This company, it belonged to Vale, the giant mining company that was involved with the 2 worst environmental disasters in Brazil history. If you remember the dam collapses that we had in Minas Gerais state, in the southeast region. In the end of 2020, the company sold it to another company, an energy company called BBF. So that's the top one. The second player, and for example, in 2017, Biopalma accounted for 2/3 of Brazil exports, according to Trades, okay, the platform that tracks the supply chains. The second player is Agropalma. We also cover this company in the story, but it's not related to indigenous people. This company, it's part of a Brazil-based conglomerate that acts in a wide variety of sectors like finance, financial sector, insurance, tourism, etc. And that's the only Brazilian company certified by RSPO.
The RSPO is the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil.
The international certification that ensures sustainability to palm oil companies. But this company is in another area, it's close to another municipality, So it's not in this area. We cover that by another research that found trace of pesticides around their plantations. The other company that we covered that has conflicts with the indigenous people is called Brazil Belém Bioenergia, BBB. It had Petrobras, Brazil's giant oil company, as one of its key players until a while back. But Petrobras sold it to other companies, so now it's controlled by another company. So they were involved in the conflicts with the També people in the També Reserve we visited. So, we could say they are the three major players. And Pará accounts for more than 90% of Brazil palm oil production. The remaining percentage, I think it's in Bahia, it's in the Northeast region. So, the bulk of the palm oil region is in Pará, and in the region we visited. There are a couple of municipalities. And beyond Sandra's research, there are other studies that were done in the production area, and all of them found trace of pesticides in different municipalities that compound this palm oil cluster in Pará.
You spoke with representatives from these companies as part of your investigation. What did they say in response to the allegations of water pollution and deforestation resulting from their operations?
No, I talked to all of them. Giving them the right to respond, of course, and also a lot of space in the stories, with all the detailed claims. And AgroPalma, for example, always gave us interview. Their director of sustainability. Usually they kind of contest the studies and deny the allegations. The other companies sent statements. Some of them, as we had this change in the management of BBB and BioPalma, so in the end of last year, so, they were kind of, acknowledging, but they said that they didn't have enough information about the studies, the methodology, but they somehow committed to, BBB at least, to did an investigation about the claims and to look closely the situation of the water courses. And it also committed to do an impact study in the area. So basically this, usually they deny, they say that they follow all the environmental requirements, but in reality, we see that the residents claim, all these effects they are suffering. There are a lot of things, that led to these effects they are suffering, the license process that were very permissive. And, we had constitutionally to protect the indigenous areas, but then they have a kind of 10 kilometers, of a buffer zone. But then the Pará state said that the palm oil isn't, their polluting grade is very low, and so, they issued a simplified license process. At the same time, we had this deforestation issues, so that's a lot that come towards all these effects in the areas. It's anyone is connected to the other.
So is it federal law or Pará state law that has this loophole that's letting these companies build plantations with no buffer zone to protect nearby communities?
Well, no, actually there is this loophole in the Brazilian law because they say that you have to have a buffer zone for conservation units, which is this 10 kilometers buffer zone. But it didn't specify, didn't include, the indigenous reserves there. But many prosecutors try to do an analogy saying indigenous reserves are somehow conservation units as they are protected areas, But for some major development projects, for example, like dams, they do, this buffer zone, for many other projects. The thing is that, and then for palm oil, there was this state law in Pará that considered it as that it had low impact. And because of that, it didn't need to go through all the complex license process that usually other major development projects have to face. And then they just did a simplified environmental process. And during the investigation, I talked to a researcher who was doing, because it was really a complex issue to understand all this under this license, because I was there and said, but it has to have a distance of 10 kilometers. How is this palm oil here? So just to understand all this mess, took me months, to find this researcher who had the documents, the license. And it's unbelievable, as when you look at the documents, there isn't any requirement for a buffer zone. It just says that the company has to do what's already required for them by the regular law, and the states simply rely on their self-monitoring, about what they are doing. And in some cases, there is also an overlap of a license from the municipality and the state, So it's really, really unbelievable, and I know that many people say, well, okay, but the 169 Convention has a force of law, a federal law in Brazil.
The International Labor Organization Convention number 169, which was ratified by the Brazilian Senate, guarantees indigenous peoples the right to free, prior, and informed consultation over projects that affect their lands and rights.
So they should follow this. A state law couldn't have the power, to knock it down. But as they say that palm oil plantations is not degrading activity, so that's the gap and the abyss in this, and the fight to prove the damages, because the prosecutors, think that if they prove the damages, so they can change everything. But the thing is that the justice is so slow. It's been 7 years already, and we heard claims, beyond all the most common things, diarrhea, headaches. There are deaths of people, cancer occurrences, and, and people who they say they died because of this pesticide contamination. So I think it's really, really serious.
So we're going to speak with Sandra Damiani about her research in the Ture Mariquita Indigenous Reserve. Can you just set that up a bit for us? Tell us about her role in the story that you reported.
Well, I told you in the beginning that, the first motivation that I had for this story was the land grabbing, that I still will write, to do a long piece about this. But then in the middle, I found this, the things that are happening to traditional people, especially indigenous reserves. And a key finding was a research conducted by the University of Brasilia into the Ture Mariquita Indigenous Reserve, where they found traces of pesticides in streams and groundwater. This research was conducted by Sandra Damiani. She was the lead researcher for this study, and it was really interesting. And she published this in 2017, and I was astonished, as nobody published anything about this, any news report about that. So when I found that, I said, no, that's huge. We need to cover that, and this water contamination, because from the time I was on the ground, these pesticide claims all the time, came to me, and I thought, we need to find something to do this connection. So her study was, really important to build this investigation. And as she found beyond the pesticides in both the streams and wells, and this is really concerning, because if the streams are contaminated, usually people use the water wells. But if both are contaminated, what will they do? And in fact, in some communities we went to, the people weren't using the water from the rivers anymore, but they're using the wells, and they were feeling the same symptoms from the ones who were using the streams. So it was really important, and her study was really complete, as she also covered other problems in the Torre Mariquita Reserve, like deforestation, to the forested areas that became palm oil, scarcity of game and fish, invasion of snakes, and other animals that compromised indigenous people health. So, and also the lack of a transparency to get access to all the things. So her study was really important. And around that, I started, finding other research that we had in Brazil for 2008, for other years into palm oil plantations. There was one that I used that referred to a quilombola area. I went to that area as well, not specifically the same, but it's the same quilombola region. And I heard the claims, and I found the academic study that was really, they also found, they didn't do the water analysis as Sandra did, but they also did this satellite imagery analysis, showing deforestation that area for palm oil. And there is another study. All of these are conducted by Brazilian researchers that found glyphosate and atrazine in another palm oil cluster. But in that area, we don't have indigenous reserves. We have some small family farmers. We have some quilombola affected by oil spills. That's something that I also covered in the piece that as I digged, I found, because as these palm oil mills are very close to the river without any buffer zone, so there is another very serious environmental issue, because the effluents go to the river, and also there are some oil spills that contaminate the water, and trigger fish, and it's damage fishing and another thing. So, and then after that, I found some global studies talking about deforestation for palm oil in the Amazon as well. But the water contamination by pesticides from palm oil monoculture, in indigenous reserves, Sandra's study was the first one.
All right, well, let's hear from Sandra Damiani herself.
My name is Sandra Damiani. I have a degree in Master Studies and Sustainable Development from the University of Brasilia.
Tell us what your study found in the Ture Mariquita Indigenous Reserve.
We researched the perception of the Tembé people from the establishment of the oil palm plantation around their lands. And then we applied 3 methodologies to catch not only the narratives of the indigenous people, but also to determine the lab analysis of the samples of water regarding the pesticides in water. And also we use satellite imagery to check out if the patches of the regenerating forest around their lands, if they were cut down. What we found out from our research were many impacts were perceived by the Tembé people. They felt changes on the water courses, so the degradation of the water courses. They say the impacts of loss of the forest, the vegetation loss. They found changes in reducing the number of the animals, and also the proliferation of insects and snakes, the occurrence of health problems, they mentioned as well, and also change in the microclimate, so higher temperatures in the villages and the neighboring areas as well. And they also felt insecure, and there was an increase in logging activity around their lands because the new roads the oil palm plantation built. Actually, my research covered a wide range of social and environmental impacts.
You sampled 6 streams within the reserve and found all of them contaminated?
Yeah, we found out that all the streams had at least one contaminant during the 2 seasons we looked at dry season and wet season, and also 40% of the wells showed residues of glyphosate, contaminant, herbicide in water in the wells they used to drink. Actually, the water courses they call igarapés, the small streams, and together with the wells were the only source of water for them to drink and to bath, for everything. Also cultural activities that base their culture and tradition.
When you say you found these residues in the wells, that means the groundwater was also contaminated, right?
Yeah, we did not use the term contaminated, and it's quite. I'll explain why. Because the residues we found, they are within legal limits in Brazil. But if we take the legal limits from Europe, for example, all of them are well above the legal limits to be safe. And then you are right, is the water they are taking, they have. Of course, this research was the first one. We'd like to highlight that for our knowledge from literature is the first research that happened to check out the presence of pesticides on indigenous lands that are in the Amazon and are surrounded by oil palm plantation. And it raises our concern that in this, let's say, this overview, in this research that was the first one, we had this data showing that at least 40% of the wells were showed residues of glyphosate.
What is the impact to people from these residues of things like glyphosate in their water?
Yeah, we can look at this situation from many perspectives, Mike. First of all, there was a very strong period. It was when the plantation was establishing itself, when they were applying the much more quantity of pesticides, and they felt very strongly health symptoms. So, for example, the most common headache and blisters and rashes and diarrhea, and these ones are the most common they felt. And it was very, very, very bad, disturbed a lot their daily lives, and also they do not have support. They suffer a lot with the consequences of this exposure. At the same time, they claimed to have been passing to this kind of exposure. But at that time, it was around 2010, they did not have a lab analysis of the water. So it was the first years, right? After that, they are still, till today, they are still with the plantation around their lands. Some of the symptoms keep showing, for example, headache. It's very, very common in the indigenous land. And what happened is that the concern we are raising is that they are exposed to 3 contaminants we found. So an herbicide, glyphosate, and 2 insecticides, endosulfan and the DDT. So they are exposed chronically to these compounds, toxic compounds, in low doses, right? That in Brazil are considered okay, but in other countries not, and that they are with this chronic exposition. So to protect these people should have a monitoring of that, and also more research to certify that they are not under risk, for example.
The levels of contaminants you found are within legal limits under Brazilian law, but do you think that they're safe?
From the literature we have, scientific literature we have till now, we can tell that it's time to reveal our limits in Brazil. We have a permissive limit. If you compare with other countries, we are much higher. Of course, there is countries that are so permissive as Brazil, as United States, for example. But if we look at the results, the data we have in literature, in scientific literature, we really have to have a committee to start reviewing our limits, the limits of pesticides, residues in water in Brazil. Another thing I would like to point out is that it's really essential to create buffer zones around to protect indigenous territories, indigenous reserves and villages from the establishment of oil palm plantations. We don't have this legal limit right now, and it's very important to bring it out. Also to forbid oil palm plantations in the vicinities of indigenous villages and also traditional communities. Right now we have this situation in Pará, that is the major producer in Brazil. Around 95% of the oil palm plantation is in Pará. And in these areas, we would advise to have frequent monitoring of the water to detect any pesticides residues, and to have a better picture of this possible exposure.
What other environmental impacts did you look at in your study?
One of our findings were also to find out that 300 hectares of forest that was recovering were deforested around the area, and these forest, the secondary forest, was very important for them because it connected to the old forests a little bit far from there, and it served as a corridor for the biodiversity.
What was the extent of the deforestation you found, and how did that impact the local communities?
For you to understand, that area passed through many actions that disturbed that environment. So the last one was cattle pasture, but they were abandoned. So what happened is that the forest started to recover itself again. And then it's the patches, these patches around the forest of the indigenous reserve, it served as a corridor for the animals. And indigenous people used a lot the territory around their reserve to hunt and to collect fruits and honey and seeds and everything they need, wood. And then these fragments of forest, they were quite important for them. And once the plantation established itself, the first measure were cut down, at least as we could by analysis of satellite imagery, at least 330 hectares were cut down. It seems not so much for Brazil terms, that here is everything so huge, right? But if you think that the whole reserve has around 700, a little bit more, hectares, so it's almost half a reserve outside it that was cut down. And then they felt many consequences of that. this is a very important point, because the deforestation of these patches, these fragments of forest, they are connected with all the other main impacts. So the degradation of the changes in water they felt, and the disappearance of animals, between them the birds, for example, they started not see the number of the birds they used to have, and also the richness of many species of birds they used to have in that area. And the number of animals reduced as well, the animals they used to hunt, the game species. And many trees that they used to collect native fruits were cut down. And then, yeah, for them the impact was huge. They used to say that the Igarapé, the small stream, once there was a rainy time, it passes like 8 to 10 days without being clean. And the process there were quite fast. I mean, in general, normally the natural process, they have rain, and very fast another day the water was clean. But during this time, because the naked soil and the silting up process, they have the streams many days without being able to drink it or even bath in it. So it was a huge impact for them.
Researchers like Sandra Damiani aren't the only ones looking into the impacts of palm oil production on the Amazon rainforest and the indigenous peoples who call those forests home. Carla Mendes writes on Manga Bay that federal prosecutors have been pursuing legal challenges against some of Brazil's leading palm oil exporters for the past 7 years over allegations that the companies are contaminating rivers, poisoning the soil, and harming the health and livelihoods of indigenous and traditional peoples, charges the companies deny. Here's Carla telling us about how one of those federal prosecutors, Felicio Ponches Jr., factored into her investigation.
There is a lot of academic investigation being done and good work, but it's just being buried, in universities. That's something that I keep thinking, and that's something that Manga Bay cares a lot, that, to do our stories based on science. I kept finding, a lot of these studies, so they were really important. And at the same time, when I look at it on the legal side, and then I was really, it was really triggered me to understand how those plantations could be so close to these indigenous reserves. And then I talked to several prosecutors, and one of them is Felicio Pontes Jr., who was the author of the lawsuit against Biopalma in 2014. By that time, he was trying to get a court ruling to authorize him to do a forensic report to prove the water contamination in the Turé-Mariquita area, because he already knew, of course, he was aware of this loophole of the legislation, that's so permissive for palm oil. And then the only way to get something done was to prove the contamination. And so I remember that he told me that they had set up a plan to monitor the water for a year, an entire year, in the area. But then, they got an injunction, then it was, they knocked it down, and then they were waiting for this. But their work, no doubt that they are really important to help the indigenous people, as federal prosecutors are the ones by law who can act before the justice for them, I mean, they are in charge of acting on the indigenous people behalf. But one thing is that, is they have the claims, they have, that they don't consider, they just want as it wasn't a proof, you know what I mean? They are having these complaints, they are already reporting all the change they suffered. And it's frustrating to see that the court doesn't consider that, to as a damage already, and to act and to issue some measures to help these people. In Sandra's research, for example, she collected some information from health workers from the Ture Mariquita area, and they said that before palm oil plantations, they didn't have any record about headaches, and diarrhea, this kind of thing. So they had this data showing that after the palm oil plantations came, 1 year later, they started having all these records about the impact on their health. So it's really complicated. It sounds like, a lack of will to do something for them.
And now we're going to talk with Felicio Pontes Jr. himself.
I'm Felicio Pontes Jr., and I'm a federal prosecutor in the Amazon region.
Can you tell us a bit of the background here on how and why you started investigating palm oil companies for violating indigenous people's rights?
It was quite unbelievable, Mike. I was told by Lucio Tembé, it's a leader, a chief from the indigenous people, Tembé, and they came to my office and started to tell me a lot of bad things that was happening in the indigenous reserves, like a lot of snakes in the area. For example, the river that was contaminated, and a lot of diseases that the indigenous people was faced. So it was unbelievable in that time, because we couldn't think that something like this could happen in a very little indigenous reserve in the Amazon region in the state of Pará.
And a lawsuit has been filed against one of the companies, Biopalma, right?
The first thing that we did was we have to prove that the thing that was happening in the indigenous reserve must be caused by a palm oil company that was just established near the area, near the indigenous reserve. But we haven't evidence about that. That's what we think. We think that we believe in the indigenous people, but we have to have some evidence, scientific evidence about that. That's why the first thing that I thought was to file a lawsuit against the oil company, Biopalma, in order to have official evidence, as official investigation by a scientific institution in the Amazon that could say as it means me, in the federal prosecutor office, to the judge, and also to the company and to the indigenous people, why they are faced this kind of problems.
And you'd like to do a forensic investigation, but so far have not been able to?
Yes, we would like to simplify the things. We decided to did this investigation in the lawsuit. It means it was an investigation that at the same time it was an official and judiciary investigation. We are not saying that Biopalma was the company that caused those problems. Not that. Absolutely. What we did at that time, it was try to answer the question: what is the things that was causing those problems to indigenous people? And we tried to do that into official investigation. Because why an official investigation? Because in an official investigation, we know the judge don't have to ask for another first thing. or another evidence. It was official evidence. So the judge have only to judge the codes. And that was what we we've got at the first time.
What are the Brazilian laws that you suspect the companies are in violation of?
There is a problem that you have to know. When the oil palm came to the Amazon, I mean 10 years ago, something like this, it was a merchandising, it was a marketing from the company and the companies, and also from the government, that it was a green industry, because it was a plantation of palm. So there is no we don't have to be concerned about that, because it's a green company, or a green industry. But it's not true. It's not true, because it's not original, endogenous, original plant from the Amazon. This is the first problem. And the second one is that they use a lot of kinds of pesticides to maintain the plantation. And in this case of biopalma, they are very near from the indigenous reserve. So it was not, and then the conclusion is that it was not a green industry, or because of only it was a plantation. No, it was very harmful to the people who live around the company, around the mill.
So, are you calling on the Brazilian government to step in and take any action, even if just to let the forensic investigation proceed?
Our strategy was that, first of all, we have to prove that this is not a green company. And so they have a special license to be installed, to work in the Amazon region. But we have a lot of markets against that. A lot of companies. We are talking about a lot of money. This is the bottom line. So we decided that it was. We cannot say to the government that they have to change this kind of licensing in terms of to turn it off in a most, how can I say that, in a difficult license to issue. There was no effect of that. We think that we will fail if we did this strategy. So we decided that, first of all, try to prove that the things that happened in the indigenous reserve was consequences of this project. And so we can, from this, we can change the view of the government about oil palm in Amazon.
So, what's the next step for you and your investigation and the lawsuit?
Well, the next step was to get in touch with a very serious and a very famous institution of research in the Amazon that we called the Evandro Chagas. Carla, I think that this is the name, Instituto Evandro Chagas.
The Evandro Chagas Institute is a public health research organization in the state of Pará's capital city, Belém.
In this institution, there was a lot of scientists dedicated to study the Amazon region, the diseases from the Amazon region, and things like this. So we decided to get in touch with them, and they were very they liked the idea. They did that. It was a problem for them. They would like to study this, and we are trying to fund this kind of research. And unfortunately, at that time, another judge that came into the cause issued a new statement, a new injunction that say that it's not necessary to do this. And we appeal from that. And I think that in the next week, I'm sure about that, next week, we're going to have a decision from the Court of Appeal in Brasilia.
The Federal Circuit Court for the First Region in Brasilia made its ruling the Monday prior to this podcast being published, actually. The court denied the forensic investigation request, claiming that it should have been done through a public civil action, meaning that prosecutors will have to file a new lawsuit 7 years after the first suit in order to continue pursuing the forensic investigation. If you enjoy the Manga Bay Newscast, we ask that you please help spread the word by telling a friend. That's the best way to help expand our reach and keep the show growing. Another way to help is by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/mangabay. We are a non-profit news outlet, so even $1 or more per month would really help us offset production costs and hosting fees. Supporters at the $10 a month level also get access to our members-only insider content. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Front Line, please head to patreon.com/mangabay to learn more and support the Manga Bay Newscast. That's patreon.com/mangabay. And you and your friend can subscribe to the Manga Bay Newscast wherever you get your podcasts from. Or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Manga Bay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And of course, you can read all of our news and inspiration from Nature's Front Line at mangabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/mangabay or on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle is @mangabay on both those platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Manga Bay Newscast. I'm your host, Mike Gorecki, signing off. Talk to you again in 2 weeks.